Code it now. Write a loop to compute the sum of the numbers from 1 to 100. Okay, so let's switch over to our JGrasp window. And here I have open an old file. It was the count to 10 class. And we're just going to create a new file with Control N. Enter to select Java. Then let's go back to our old file. Copy this code just to save ourselves a little bit of time. Control C. Go back to our untitled file. Control V. And okay, so now we can start editing this, and we'll just call this first one SumTo100. Seems appropriate. And we'll change the class name as well, SumTo100. Okay, this comment is definitely not relevant anymore. Okay. All right. So, and of course the next thing we want to do too is remove the code from inside the main method because we don't need this anymore either. All right. So for the comment, we're just going to write out what we're going to do, which is we're going to compute the sum from the numbers from 1 to 100. Okay. Now we could add in our for loop. Or actually, rather, before we add our for loop, we need to realize that since we're going to be summing, we need a separate variable to sum over. Because if we just use the variable that we declare within the for loop, the I or the J or whatever you might want to call it, then we're going to end up overwriting it, and we don't want to do that. We want to keep maintaining that same I, and we want the for loop to automatically increment it. So instead, we need to define our own sum variable, so we'll just do that right now. In sum equals 0. Okay, now we can go ahead and start with our for loop. So for int I equals, now we were told to sum from 1 to 100. So we're going to start I from 1. As long as I is less than or equal to 100, I plus plus, we increment I. And of course, we need our curly braces. Then we need to put an indent. And now we can just write our code. So what we want to do here is for each value of I, we want to add it to sum. So the way we would do that is sum plus equals I. All right, and then the last thing we might want to do, even though it's not specified in the codeIt now problem, it's always nice to check that our program works. And of course, the best way of doing that is by printing it out. So we'll just say, we'll add a comment for that. So print out the result of the sum. Okay, so now we can do a system.out.println, and we could even add in a little bit of text. Sum from 1 to 100 is, and then we do a plus because we want to concatenate, and as you can see here, I added a space after the is because you also want to make sure that, you know, the sum isn't combined with the word is. We don't want is and then some number immediately after. We want a space, and then sum. Close the parentheses, and a semicolon. All right, so now let's save this file with Control S. I'm going to accept the defaults, compile it with Control B, and there we go. Okay, finish compiling. It took a little while, but we're good to go. And then Control R to run. And there we go. The sum from 1 to 100 is 5,050. That seems about right. I'm not exactly sure, but sounds close enough. Code it now. All right, so now we're going to move on to activity 4. We've already done activity 3 in the last video. And for activity 4, we want to write a loop to compute the sum of the even numbers from 2 to 20. So as we can already tell, it's going to be very similar to the code we wrote for activity 3 because we're summing over numbers. And we're just going to have to make sure that we only sum over the even numbers between this range of 2 and 20. All right, so let's switch over to our JGrasp window. Let's create a new file, Control N. Hit Enter to select Java. Great, now let's go back to our previous file, SumTo100, and copy this code since, again, it's going to be very similar. Go back to our untitled file, Control V to paste. Now let's change the number, not the number, rather. Let's change the name, SumEvens. It seems like a logical name. And we'll change it in the class declaration as well, SumEvens. Okay, and for this, I'm actually going to leave a lot of this code since it's going to be very similar. We're just going to be changing a few things here and there. So for the comment, compute the sum of the numbers from 1 to 100. Well, instead of 1 to 100, we're going to be computing the sum of the numbers from 2 to 20, and we also need to make sure that we clarify that it's going to be the even numbers. So compute the sum of the even numbers from 2 to 20. Okay, and then we have our summing variable. This is where the sum is going to be stored in sum equals 0, semicolon, that's okay. And now we need to change our for loop because we don't want to start from 1 because 1 isn't an even number. Instead, we want to start from the first even number in that range of 2 to 20, which is 2. And then obviously we don't want to go all the way to 100. We want to stop once we hit 20. So 20. And then of course, the last thing we want to do is that we want to change the incrementer because we don't just want to increment once. We want to sum over all the even numbers. So to go over all the even numbers, we just need to make sure that we add 2 each time to I. So an easy way of doing this is I plus equals 2, like this, because in this way, every time we go through the loop, we're adding 2 each time, so we're getting every even number. So we're going to go 2, 4, 6, 8, etc. And this way we can keep the code inside the for loop the same, just sum plus equals I. And we can print out the result. So the only difference is, of course, we're going to change our quote here because we're no longer talking about 1 to 100. So sum of the even numbers from 2 to 20. And everything else can stay the same. Great. So now let's save our file, Control S, enter to accept the defaults, Control B to build. Great, so our operation completed successfully. And another thing to keep in mind too is you shouldn't be afraid to do something like this within the for loop. It's perfectly acceptable because all you're really doing is specifying how you want to change the value of I as the loop goes along. So this can be something as simple as this, where you're incrementing by a certain amount of numbers, like I plus equals 2. It could even be I minus equals. It all depends on what you need. And then we can do Control R to run the program. And perfect. Sum of the even numbers from 2 to 20 is 110. And that sounds pretty reasonable. It's definitely going to be a much smaller number than what we had last time when we did the previous activity on this page, since we were going from 1 to 100. So I believe that it worked correctly.